Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, stone cold killer of the contemporary American intellectual scene. There has not been a podcast episode lately, and there are two reasons for that. One is I was hustling to finish the first draft of The Good Enough Marriage, which is the book that I'm co-authoring with my wife. And the second is that I was brutally abandoned by my former editor-producer, the nefarious Robert Scaramuccia, who had the gall to prioritize his own interests over my need for a highly skilled but undercompensated professional editor. No, just kidding. Robert's great. Actually, I'm working with him on another project, but he had to prioritize. The return of the pod with this episode heralds good news on both fronts. The book draft has been submitted to the publisher, and though there will be revisions that need to be done over the next few months, the schedule will be much easier going for me from now on. So that's great. I have more time freed up by the completion of the draft, and I have also secured a new editor, or two, sort of. This episode, and at least one more, are being edited by longtime friend of the pod, Joshua Howard. And half or more of future episodes will be edited by the entity that will be announcing its sponsorship of the podcast within the next month or two. So that's great. And Josh may do some more for me as well. So we're back, in other words, stronger and more eminent than ever. And what a great episode to come back on. Former guest Damon Linker is back to talk about another former guest of the pod, the Notorious R.O.D, Ray Oliver Dreher Jr., also known as Rod Dreher, one of the more fascinating, tragic, and infuriating writers of the Christian right over the last few decades. Damon and Rod first met back when Damon, who is now a man of the solid center-left, was a conservative and an editor at the Catholic conservative magazine First Things. They bonded, as Damon recounts in our conversation, over their shared horror at the Catholic priest abuse scandal, a lot of details of which were unfolding at the time, and also their shared frustration with various figures on the Catholic right, including some important ones at First Things, who seemed to be in some kind of denial about the severity of the scandal, or if not in denial about the severity of it, then intent on shifting as much blame as possible away from the Catholic Church and onto other folks, whether that would be the gay rights movement or the left or the 60s or whatever. So Rod and Damon remained friends over the next decade and a half, even as both of them went through various evolutions and migrations. Damon migrated towards the left, although not too far to the left, and Dreher went through a series of what I would call repetitions, ever in search of some kind of structure or vessel or institution, or perhaps idol, to contain or pacify his various aspirations, contradictions, and demons. Damon and Rod broke, as Dreher has broken with many former friends and comrades over the decades, over some of what Damon and I would call Rod's extremism. They broke a few years ago, though they've been in touch a bit more recently in the aftermath of Rod's public denunciation of the right's tolerance of anti-Semites within its ranks. I should say I have long been fascinated with Dreher, though I am far from the only person on the left who has been fascinated with him. He's such a compellingly open wound of a person. He's sort of endlessly vulnerable. He's incredibly affable in one-on-one interactions, as I learned when I did my interview with him. And he is also reliably hysterical and apocalyptic when he's dealing with the broad sweep of things. And also, he's always kind of honest and principled in his own way, as he has been over the anti-Semitism stuff that he's been addressing recently. So this is, in other words, pretty primo Eminent Americans content, and it was a pleasure to have Damon back on for it, and I appreciate his candor about a former and maybe future friend of his, but I also hold him responsible for none of my reckless, irresponsible, and entirely accurate pop psychologizing of Dreher in the course of this episode. Coming up on the show are conversations with Jacob Siegel on American masculinity, with Sheila Heti on psychedelics and midlife, with David Sessions on porn, and more, and also the exciting announcement of my new partnership sponsorship. So on to the show. Hope you enjoy. Peace.
Hey, Daniel.
Hey, Damon. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm a little wired. I'm trying to finish this book that I'm working on with my wife.
Are you under a tight deadline to finish the book?
I mean, yes, in a sense. I mean, the deadline is the end of this month. I don't think, as you know, publishers don't actually expect those things to come in on time half the time. But my wife, very much, who I'm writing it with, very much expects things to come in on time. So, yes, we're treating it as though it's a hard deadline. If we said, oh, we need 2 weeks, I'm sure the editor would be like, yeah, whatever, that's great.
But you're close enough that you think you'll
close
be
enough.
close.
I think we're going to get there, yeah. So anyway, how about you? Where are you on your Leo Strauss?
I just this week began the writing of chapter 2 after lots and lots of reading and outlining while I was teaching. And I jumped out of the gate and it's going well. I think I should have that done certainly by the end of June.
Yeah.
And then I'll spend the rest of the summer plotting out chapter 3. Start writing that hopefully before classes start and finish it in the fall. And that'll leave the final chapter and then the intro with the whole thing due by the end of next April. So that's my, I think, more relaxed deadline than the one you're dealing with. But I'm exactly on track, so I should be able to make the deadline.
All right, well, let's get going. Damon Linker, welcome back to Eminent Americans. I will reanoint you an Eminent American by virtue of the power vested in me by the newly installed, I don't even know if they're installed in Hungary yet, the newly installed government of Hungary, post-Orban.
Yeah, it's led by Johnny American, the guy whose last name means Hungary.
That's right. I forgot that. Yeah, I mean, this is the third leg on your, maybe the second leg on your tour of podcasts hosted by Oppenheimers in recent weeks.
True enough. Yes, I was on the ARC podcast with your brother Mark not long ago at all. In fact, we recorded it about a month or so ago, but it just dropped a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, Mark and I had to do rock, paper, scissors to determine who would get to sort of go into depth on our topic for today, R.O.D. Dreher, because it's so juicy and desirable, and I won. No, I mean, I don't think he was ever planning to have that be the focus of his conversation with you, though it did come up briefly, I think, right?
Yeah, and when he first approached me about coming on, I think it was inspired by something I had written on
right.
R.O.D.
Yep.
So I assumed we would talk about R.O.D, but he sort of went around him in particular, and we spoke more broadly about my time on the religious right 20 years ago or so.
Yeah, it was interesting. Well, folks should listen to that as well. That's a totally different. I actually learned a lot of things about you that I didn't know and your past. Though I think I'd heard you on other podcasts talk about some of it, but you really got into depth on your background, and kind of Mark really pushed you on some of, he just kept pushing you and trying to understand your conversion to Catholicism, and it was funny because I think at some point you were just kind of like, yeah, I don't really understand it either, Mark.
I mean, I do at this point. The honest truth though is that really the only people who truly get it are me and my therapists. Uh-huh. And I say plural because I've had a few over the decades. But this was definitely, I remember shortly after I broke from the religious right and Catholicism, and I was working on the Theocons, the book that I wrote about this experience. And some magazines, as the book was coming out, approached me would you like to write something about how this happened, why this happened? And I, of course, was very eager for any kind of publicity to help launch the book. And I said yes. And then I sat down to try to write it up in a way that would make sense and utterly failed, and realized at that moment, I got to figure this out because I can't even explain it in a way that is anything other than just a kind of chronicle of this happened, then that happened, then this other thing happened. And by now, I think I get it, but it's very intertwined with quirks of my upbringing and traumas from my childhood, typical Freudian kind of stuff.
That's right up my alley.
Yeah.
And also a nice segue to our topic for today's conversation. I guess we have two, but topic one, and the primary one, is your friend or ex-friend, R.O.D. Dreher, who I've only met once virtually. I did an interview with him some months ago, maybe a year ago. And this is a post that you did recently, kind of segueing from that into this post that you wrote on, I think you titled Thoughts on a Semester Spent with the Reactionary Right. So thinking about kind of various figures, of whom Rod was one. I don't know if you assigned him, but you kind of, in the post, you sort of talked about him as a kind of contemporary example of a type that you had observed and kind of deconstructed over the course of this semester.
Yeah, I mean, we were reading a lot of different reactionary figures. I did not assign Rod on the syllabus, but he's too scattered to work that way. Even his books have a sort of bloggy quality to them that doesn't, it's sort of like pointillistic. If you pick one thing, it's just one little bit of the larger picture. But there were a few points in the semester when on his Substack he wrote something that was pertinent to what we were writing, and so I had cut and pasted and sent it to the class through Canvas and say, you might want to just take a look at this Rod Dreher post. So we ended up talking about him at a few points as a very relevant contemporary example of the kind of things that we were reading about in a little more of a high-level intellectual or academic way in the assigned readings.
Well, I mean, I want to start, I guess, with kind of how you either first met Rod or came to be aware of him. I assume you probably came to be aware of him as a writer before you met him, but maybe not. Give me the backstory on Rod and you.
Well, I was working at First Things when I think I was working there when he first came on my radar, or maybe I even was aware of him before that. He was kicking around on the center right then. He was writing, I think, first film reviews for the New York Post, and then he was, I think, if I recall, this is a long time ago, like quarter century ago now, but I think he was then for a time on the op-ed page at the Post. So at that point, I was sort of center-right myself and then looking for work in that world, and that's how I ended up at First Things. So he was one of the people around. He was also at that point writing for National Review, and I think then eventually had a position there as a writer and editor. But I really got to know him when in the events around the priest child abuse scandal really broke, which was just shortly after 9/11, I believe in early 2020, or in, not 2002. And he was writing about this, but I could tell was encountering pushback on the right at National Review itself, where they were sort of indicating that he should calm down. NR was and is heavily Catholic in its staffing, even though it's not officially Catholic in the way that I think First Things now is. That wasn't either back then, even though Newhouse, Father Newhouse, was the editor and founder of it, but it just nominally, First Things was supposed to be interreligious, combining kind of conservative Orthodox Catholics with evangelical, conservative, white evangelical Protestants, even Orthodox Jews, and even before 9/11, some conservative and abiding religious Muslims were also included in the tent. After 9/11, that became pretty fraught. But so Rod was writing about these things. I was beginning to struggle at First Things, both about the magazine's defense of Bush's response to 9/11 and the buildup to the war in Iraq, which I opposed from the beginning. But then also when the priest abuse scandal began and Newhouse relatively quickly became pretty defensive about it and writing large chunks of his 10,000 word monthly column about it in this very defensive way that was really rubbing me the wrong way. We started having periodic lunches. It was a little bit like, I don't want to, sound too caricatured or extreme about it, because it really wasn't to this extent, but it was a little bit like a couple of guys, in the in Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, who would like meet in a cafe where they didn't think it was bugged and like talk about, what was really going on. And so we would kind of commiserate about.
This is you and Rod. This is you're in New York.
City.
Where are you? New York,
Yeah.
DC? Okay. Do you remember what cafe? Was there a specific
No,
cafe
it was
that you
just
met
lunch in the neighborhood. I mean,
Okay. And that's what, and you would talk specifically about, I mean, it was primarily about the priest abuse scandal. You were both within these publications where there was a desire, if not to sort of utterly excuse or apologize for it, to sort of minimize it or maybe refocus attention on the ill intentions of the critics or the ways that the left was kind of exploiting this to further their separate agenda or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, Newhouse's on the priest scandal, his take became very quickly that a sort of tautology that like, well, any priest who would do this was a bad Catholic. So if only they were more Catholic, this would never have happened. So he would go on like Meet the Press and say, 3 things to address the priest scandal are necessary. Fidelity, fidelity, fidelity. Meaning, read the catechism more closely and abide by it more strictly. Don't go down the path of Vatican II and fudging the moral distinctions about sexual morality. Read more John Paul II encyclicals on the theology of the body and things like this. And there's some truth to that, but it struck me as very self-serving and again defensive, as a sort of a way of skirting what I considered to be the deeper issue, which is the product of the celibacy requirement. Now, I was not at the point of saying, they should dump that whole 2,000-year tradition in a heartbeat, but like it just felt evasive and sort of intellectually dishonest. Like he was running a sort of PR campaign for the church, which was what I came to think our magazine was doing with the Bush administration on Iraq, especially after the invasion, and it clearly was not going well. And yet, people within the administration would fax us talking points that would then end up being regurgitated in Newhouse's column verbatim without him doing any independent checking with journalists on the ground there to see if it was true. And so that really played into what became my rejectionist stance about all of this and led to my departure, was that, I didn't become a writer and intellectual in order to work for a PR firm to make these people in power look good, to advance a political movement that if this is the political movement, I don't want to be advancing it. So why would I be doing this to make it look good when it's actually screwing things up pretty badly?
It's interesting, as you're talking, I sort of made a connection between you and Rod that I hadn't really made before, though it's a little surprising, which is just questions of whether you want to call it conversion or evolution or the sort of rejection of prior paradigms or beliefs. And I don't know why I didn't make the connection, because I certainly knew that you were somebody who moved from, well, I think in part it's because the structure of your change is very different than Rod's, right? So yours has been, and these kind of have value judgments baked into them, which I don't intend, but just in terms of like literally the structure of it, yours has been a kind of a movement from point A to point B, and Rod's has in a sense been a little bit more of a hamster wheel.
I would actually describe it in some ways as a little differently. Mine was from A to B to A because I've ended up where I started, and in the arc of my life, my sojourn into the church was a relatively brief episode that I ended up pretty much repudiating, and I've ended up back with secular Judaism again. Whereas Rod has been like an ever-increasing search for a pure form of Christian piety from sort of watery Protestantism in which he was raised in Louisiana to a kind of evangelicalism. First evangelicalism, then to Catholicism, then to Eastern Orthodoxy.
When you two were communing, secretly, at the cafe in the village or something like that, at the, what's that, the Polish diner or something like that in the East Village, you were both Catholic, right? And I mean,
Yes.
you were probably starting the process of moving out of it.
Not yet. No, I mean, I had actually only joined about a year earlier.
Oh, you'd only joined. And I'm not sure the structure of his belief altered that much from his conversion to Catholicism to Eastern Orthodoxy. My sense of it is he came to the conclusion that the kind of institution of the church had been revealed as so fundamentally corrupted by the priest abuse scandal that he just couldn't ally himself to it anymore or pledge fealty to it anymore. And so he kind of looked out on the world for another option that had a similar structure of belief and a lot of the kind of accoutrements of Catholicism, and that he ended up in Eastern Orthodoxy. But his belief structure didn't change that much.
No, not really. I mean, I think it did in a subtle and important way in that, like many intellectual converts to the church, to Catholicism or serious Christianity, it was really it was in the form of an ideology. It was this constellation of ideas. And his own account of what happened to him is that led him to be pretty naive about the actual institution of the church, and that the priest abuse scandal showed him that, the actual institution of the church is pretty damn corrupt. Mm-hmm. And it's not this almost angelic ideological system that I fell in love with. It's actually this other thing that is actually pretty gross and very much a human, all too human institution that's corrupt and self-dealing and self-perpetuating and protects its own and throws people under the bus, including young kids and their families, to protect itself. And so when he moved to Eastern Orthodoxy, it was both a fleeing from that institution and then gravitating to an alternative that has as much historical linkages to the original founding of the Christian church as Catholicism. As I'm sure you know, they diverged roughly 1,000 years ago, and before that point there was no distinction between East and West. And so there are some differences, important differences, but they tend to be more like liturgical differences, like how they celebrate either Mass or the service, and things wrapped up with.
And notably, their priests can marry.
Yeah,
and so,
exactly.
And so probably they don't have the same. They don't sort of produce the same kind of sexual dysfunction that has ended up happening.
Right,
in the Catholic Church.
And there is also less of a tendency. I don't know if this is more like folk Catholicism as opposed to something directly out of official teaching, but Catholics have a way of treating the institutional church as, we're God's people on earth. Like, Christ founded the church. It's handed down pope to pope to pope to pope. The bishops and the cardinals are under the pope. The priests are under the bishops and cardinals. The lay people are under the priests. It's all this structure, and it has a direct tie to Jesus at the beginning. And so it's sort of like an electrical circuit where like it's plugged in on one end and it glows from beginning to end. It's like there's a tendency.
You're saying your sense is that the Greek Orthodox clergy don't have quite the same kind of aura don't have quite the same glow in the eyes of their parishioners, and maybe therefore less likely to be kind of entrusted in ways that might blind oneself to the potential pitfalls of trusting these people.
Yeah. Now, I'm no expert on Eastern Orthodoxy, but the very fact that these Eastern churches are broken into nationally based churches, so that you have Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, and so forth, shows that it is more of a political institution, and thus there is somewhat less of an assumption that the people who you encounter in this institution are like sanctified in some way, purer than any other human, all too human institution. And so there's less to be disappointed by.
Right. So I have a question kind of about when you first became friends with Rod, kind of more in a sort of personality sense. How did he strike you? Because I was going to say, you offered up a kind of initial hypothesis about Rod's evolution that was kind of ever searching for greater purity. The way I have thought about it, which is maybe a kind of more Freudian way, is like always looking for a home or a father, right? And so that it's not a journey deeper and deeper into purity. It's just it's an investment in, I guess, what one might call a false idol or something like that. It's a search for a father or a home or some combination of those two that ultimately and inevitably fails because it can't contain what Rod wants to pour into it. And then he has to go find a new one. But I want to get to that, but I do want to ask you, what was your sense of him just as a person back then? And maybe you weren't encountering him in that way with that analytical lens like you might now after a lot of therapy or something like that. But who was he to you? How would you have characterized him?
I actually, and I we'll get back to it later, I assume, but even some of those formulations about him that you got from what I said, I don't think are quite right, and I'd want to correct some of that. But on him, I think my initial feeling of him was a real kind of kinship. I think that I had a PhD in political philosophy. I was raised as a secular Jew. He was not. He has, I think, only a bachelor's in I forget what. He was a journalist. Had a very different religious trajectory, different culturally from the Deep South. So lots of differences, but sort of existentially, he felt like a kindred spirit to me. It might not be that apparent because I have cultivated the things that in myself that are very much like Rod are more controlled than his are. We both, under the surface for me and on the surface for him, are very churning, passionate, searching people who have a tendency toward reactivity, being sort of triggered by things that strike us as morally wrong or repulsive or I sensed him when we would have these lunches that he was very earnest. Things mattered to him. Truth with a capital T mattered deeply to him. And I think we have since moved, and by since I mean within like a year or two of when we met. So we're talking 2002 to 2004. Since then, we have moved in very different directions in our passionate search for truth. But we share that quest as sort of the nerve of our souls, if you will. And so he has, what I would correct about what you said about him maybe, or tweak it a little bit, adjust it, is just to say that I think I was wrong to indicate that he was always moving forward toward more purity. I think he sort of has always, from around 20 or so years ago after the priest abuse scandal, he's been pretty, I think, stationary. He sort of thinks he has it.
Yes, at any given moment, right?
What's changed, I think, and I'm sure we'll get into this more as we move closer to the present and talking about him, is his reaction to the failure of the world to conform to the way he fervently believes it ought to be. And so it's more at kind of the level of practice more than the level of theory, if you will, if you take theory and practice as a dichotomy. And so he seems pretty consistent, like he's been, even before, into the Catholic period when I knew him, he was a genuinely true believing social conservative, and the things in that really mattered to him were sexual related things, abortion, gay marriage, homosexuality, then trans stuff, which wasn't an issue back then but became one, and then all all the social conservative things that are like, 1 degree of separation from that core. And I don't want to speculate about whether it's from daddy issues or something else. I mean, I'll do that sometimes with public figures, but because I do consider Rod a fraught friend who I do really care about, I don't want to speculate about that in any detail. I do think clearly something is going on with him psychologically that shows up in this. I don't know. He's created a sort of infrastructure in his career and its interaction with his job as a writer and technological developments with like social media and information and his easy exchange of views with his very devoted, loyal readership who share his worries and anxieties, that has created a sort of feedback loop of continually deepening, radicalizing despair. That has like linked in with those deeper theological convictions that he's had from the beginning, or at least from my beginning with him.
I want to go back to, this was really fascinating what you were saying about kind of the kinship around kind of spiritual hunger and intensity and vulnerability to the world and reactivity and things like that. And I think when I was saying earlier that when I listened to that interview you did with my brother, there were some things that I kind of didn't know about you that I felt like I suddenly got insight into, because I had thought of you as this incredibly sort of controlled, reasonable figure, right? A person who is always on the one hand, on the other hand, a kind of Ross Douthat figure who's always like on the one hand he's advocating his point of view, but he's also very cognizant of what the opposing point of view. His tendency is to try and steelman what the people who have different views, what they believe. And what I didn't get, and you were talking a little bit about the stuff with your mom, who I think was maybe institutionalized, had pretty severe mental health issues, and just getting more into the autobiography. That is not, I don't think you're saying it's a reaction to in a simplistic sense, but it's a product of this kind of internal struggle on your part between these kind of strong roiling energies underneath the surface and a desire, I assume in some sense, to like live a flourishing life, not be ruled by them, right? To figure out ways to be a successful professional, to be a husband, to be a father, to be in the world, to have friends, where those tendencies, those instincts, if unchecked, can do a lot of damage, right? And so I'm getting a much fuller picture of you, and then that makes a lot of sense in terms of Rod, because I think in part what's so provocative about him to people who don't like him, but then also what's so oddly appealing about him, even to some people who, like me, who politically would be on the other side of him, is this just immense vulnerability that's out there. Unlike you just you read Rod for a little bit, and you just know this is a guy who just lives so close to the surface of his skin, who's so earnest, who's so raw, who's so kind of vulnerable to the injuries of the world, and so kind of self-conscious and undefended in the way that he writes and lives in the world. It kind of, you want to rescue this guy. You want to connect to this guy. You want to rescue this guy. You feel his pain.
Yeah, no, that's all I agree with everything.
Yeah.
In my own situation, this is not quite accurate, but for the sake of making for a good chat, I will say you can almost assume under the surface I am really similar to Rod.
Huh.
The difference between us is that I do not trust those parts of myself. I think they mislead me. I think they lead me to make bad decisions, like, for instance, converting to the Catholic Church in a moment of a low point, in a moment of lostness and desperation to kind of make a change that would fix things. That shows that I'm prone to making leaps, ideological as well as theological. I am, as I said, reactive. I am inclined toward a kind of deep gloom and pessimism, and that certainly shows up in what I write.
Yeah.
But I have learned over many, many years of making mistakes and then cultivating a public persona as a writer to impose on that churning core of myself a kind of rationalistic superstructure that channels it, checks it, uses it as a kind of fuel to both power my own thinking and to keep myself open to understanding people on the other side, because I feel some of it in myself.
Yeah.
But then when I actually come down in a position in my own name, it is a rationalistic, better version of myself that I impose on myself. Because I know that if I give free rein to the more volatile parts of myself, I will regret it, because I'll say stupid shit. I'll embarrass myself.
Yeah.
I won't have thought through the consequences of it. And so,
has it gotten you into trouble on social media? I mean, that must have been an interesting platform for you, because, as you pointed out with Rod, like, it's so optimized to enable and encourage that kind of quick reactivity and bypass the like system 2 or whatever.
I became very good at this from my experience on Twitter circa 2014 to 2020. And I will say I have never once had a bad moment on social media like a lot of people have, where like, you know, Andrew Sullivan's had like 10,000 of these, where like he totally loses. Andrew's another person, by the way, who's very much like this and like Rod. And for him, it is closer to the surface than it is for me, but less so than Rod. And he's capable, like me, of imposing a kind of rationalized evenness to it when he wants. He does not always want to.
Well, I was going to say, I was thinking there's like I'm thinking of like the Dreher to Linker spectrum, right? And Andrew's kind of in the middle. And what's interesting about him as opposed to you, and it's almost like, what is the length of the cycle, right? So you have sort of shortened the cycle of like reactivity to reason and deliberation to this very short sort of turnaround, right? Andrew's process is he'll fly off the handle, but he has the capacity over time, and he gets feedback from people to over time kind of integrate that into a more reasoned perspective.
But all three of us have this kind of volcanic core.
Yeah, right. Well, and as you said, you know, and it's interesting, it is a very potent thing for a writer to have, right? And then the question is, what do you do with it, right? So what Rod does with it is kind of just give it, you know, utterly unfettered reign, right? And so
not only that, but I'll get back to social media, because it does play an important role here for me. But with Rod, this gets back to what I said earlier about him kind of being in this infrastructure of journalism, Substack, and his career and his audience feedback looping. He has created a situation where he is deliberately triggering this aspect of himself every single day.
You mean just he's got this like feed of like the, you know, the outrage of the day, the trans outrage of the day that is just, he's piping directly, you know, he's shooting directly into his veins to activate it, and then he, you know, runs it through that filter, then he pops out his writing, and then his readers, you know, come back at him.
And it just, there is always a new outrage. There's some story somewhere that he finds on his own by trolling social media, or his readers send it to him, like, did you see this, Rod? And that is how he powers on and writes his, you know, roughly 5 incredibly long posts a week. And before that, it was at the American Conservative, his blog there for many years. It's this pattern of outraging himself, ODing on outrage, and using that outrage to come up with something to say about it all. But the problem is that so easily becomes your kind of self-curated, distorted funhouse mirror version of the world, where you get convinced that basically every Democrat is a lunatic leftist, and we're on the verge of Weimar Part 2, and maybe a collapse of Western civilization, and maybe the economy's going to collapse.
I don't know if there's any maybe about it. He's pretty 90+% convinced that is what we are experiencing.
Exactly,
right.
And you've set up a filter of reality for yourself where all you're seeing is the self-confirmatory information. And he's one who's written a lot and very wisely and intelligently about things like confirmation bias. He knows what that is. He knows it's a problem. And he'll even sometimes in moments of self-awareness will say, like, I know I'm at risk of confirmation bias here. However, here's another 3,000 words about how in this case it's not actually that, it's actually true. So if we go back to my experience on social media in that earlier period when all the kind of the lefties were running the show, I never let myself say something that I truly deeply regretted and had to have a big public mea culpa to save my job. Now, one of the reasons why is because I am extremely self-determined to say not lose my job. And so when I was a columnist at The Week from 2014 to 2022, which overlapped with that earlier period, I was on Twitter all the time, but my main line in my bio on Twitter was columnist at The Week, and I knew that my employers expected me to behave like a representative of the company and not embarrass them. And so I never once allowed that to happen. However, I did frequently get dragged by massive rounds of people, very often by like Jamel Bouie's thousands and thousands of ditto heads.
Bowie is I should do an episode on him once. He's a uniquely he's an interestingly nefarious character on social media, much more than he is as a kind of columnist or something like that. But there is a...
Oh, I know. And when I see him on like a podcast, he seems like a perfectly decent, nice, very smart guy. But on social media, he's cultivated this persona as the ultimate giving red meat to his own bleachers kind of thing. Like everything is just snarky.
Yes, it's very snarky.
Anyone half a millimeter to his right, which it very much includes me because I'm a center guy. And so, like, I'm the enemy. People like me are the enemy, and actually more than people further right who he ignores. So, like, people like Matt Iglesias, he can't stand.
Right. I was going to say about Bowie, like what's fascinating about him in a way, although it'd be hard to sort of get at it, is as a writer in his column or in magazine pieces or something like that, he's actually a very sober-minded writer, right? I mean, he has a certain kind of political position, but he's not that dissimilar from your style in a way.
Right.
And then on social media, he's like, there's some kind of queen bee quality to what he's doing that's very different, although very probably central to his kind of market value in a way. Because I'm not sure as a writer he's that interesting. But on social media, he's kind of more interesting in a way than he is.
I guess. I mean, I don't find it interesting. I'm delighted he left for Blue Sky and let him be there forever.
He'll be back.
Never want to see him again.
They're going to come back.
They're going to come back, but I really don't want anything to do with him. I mean, I totally have the sense that if I ever end up in a bar in D.C. with Jamel Bowie and we buy each other drinks and have a conversation, I'd get along with him fine. Right. I'd love talking to him.
Right.
But I cannot stand the way he comports himself on social media. Right. I just can't stand it. And it's intentional. He wants to antagonize people exactly like me. And it's not even him. It's that he is followed by thousands of people who get off on then, he attacks me in a way that I'm like, oh, come on, man. And like, we could have a totally civil argument. Yeah. But that's not what happens. What happens is we go a couple of rounds, and then the next thing I know, I'm 10,000 tweets deep in a kind of wasp attack. And that's just totally that's just not healthy. That was, but it did. The fact is that by the time that era was over, I had become really good at just never rising to the bait. And being very, very, it being very natural to me to kind of be like, okay,
Yeah.
I just typed out a really nasty, snarky tweet. I'm going to delete that and not post that. I'll write a Substack post that's very on the one hand, on the other hand, on the third hand. And so I do that. But deep down, I'm churning, I'm pissed, I'm just a mess.
It's interesting to think about, I mean, both you and Rod, kind of the relationship to where you came from. In Rod's case, I mean, one of the things, so he came from this small town in Louisiana. I think his dad was a doctor and kind of it was a small world. His dad was a relatively significant and relatively beloved figure within it. And I think a fairly masculine type, right? A fairly like macho type. He gets this kid, Rod Dreher, who's like bookish, not athletic, nerdy, sensitive, right? Exactly the wrong kind of boy to be welcomed and embraced into this environment. Rod goes out in the world, has enough sense of, autonomy and desire for his own life that he does some pretty dramatic things to break from that, right? He leaves, and then he ends up in New York. And then he's always in this kind of like unresolved internal civil war about these things. And he's always, part of what he's doing with his writing is trying to find ways to reconcile them, right? So he writes this book, Crunchy Cons, and it's like, how do you be a sort of granola countercultural conservative? And then I think, without question, the most poignant of all the things he's written, in the sense of both in the thing itself and then what one learns about him after the fact, is this book he writes about his sister and moving back to their small town in Louisiana. His sister's, dying of cancer, I think. Yeah. And his sister, who's beloved, but who detests him, right? Who has long detested him and resented him for what she perceived of, and we only have his word for that this is her narrative, but perceived his betrayal of the family sort of tradition and leaving and becoming this big city journalist or whatever it is. So she's sick. He persuades his wife and their 4 or 5 kids to move from wherever they were. They were somewhere cosmopolitan, I think, right? They were in D.C.
They were actually living near Philadelphia, because he was, I think at that point, he was working at the Templeton Foundation, which is in Conshohocken. But I could be getting.
But I mean, whatever. He's living this relatively cosmopolitan lifestyle in the Northeast, right? Advocating for these traditional values, but living in a world that, frankly, is more suited to his temperament and his tastes than this small town in Louisiana. But he persuades his wife; they're going to move the whole family to this small town. They're going to be of the people of these good homespun small town people. Imagining that he will be embraced, that they will be embraced by these people and his sister and his parents. And I think maybe at the end of the book, that's kind of, with some complications, but that's kind of where we're left. And then one discovers in his next book, which I think is his Dante book, that he was never accepted. His sister never forgave him, never kind of really opened her arms to him. I don't think the town particularly liked him. And it got bad enough that they moved. I forget where they moved, but they left. He went into a deep depression. I think he had all sorts of health issues, like maybe a years-long case of mono or something like that. And in the depths of his despair, he found his next idol into which to invest his hopes or something like that. But
Victor!
And like, you can nuance or disagree with that characterization, but I mean, partially what do you think of that, and then partially how do you sort of calibrate with that vis-a-vis that in your own story and who you were? I guess one thing I sense from you is there was less of that kind of temperamental civil war between where you came from and where you are now than there was. You were not cast out in the same way. No.
I mean, it's hard to make parallels. I mean, I do. My background is very, very different than Rod's. I don't even know what to say about that. I mean, your general take on the story is roughly right, although I don't think his father was a doctor. He has 3 kids. So there were some things that were off.
Okay.
But he clearly does. he did leave. He is sort of, the prodigal son. He leaves the small town, which he only learns much later was viewed as a massive betrayal. So that when he comes back, he's not welcomed back, even though at first it seems like he is, but that's all sort of fake. And it slowly gets revealed to him over the coming months and couple years that, in fact, the family wants nothing to do with them, thinks they're bad news, is sure that he thinks he's better than they are. It's all a kind of weird red state resentment story about status, that like Rod left to get status from the big city, and now he's back and he still thinks he's better than we are.
That's Rod's story of it.
No, I'm only recounting that's how he sees it.
That's not a fully persuasive story. I'm sure Rod was fucking impossible. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be so confident of this, but just knowing Rod through his writing, can you only imagine what he must have been like as he moved back to this town and instantly set forth to impose his narrative on everybody else's life? I'm sure his family wasn't easy, but he was probably fucking impossible. I'm sure he just roped all of them relentlessly into his narrative of what it all meant and was totally impossible.
Could be. I have zero information.
I just know it. I'm sorry, Damon. You are more responsible than I am.
It might be a psychologically valid observation.
If any of Rod's family or friends in where was it in Louisiana? Hold on, I can find this out.
Well, Star Hill is
if
the
any
name
of you
the
happen to be
little
listeners to this
town.
show and you have inside information, feel free to email me. But I am 100% sure that is the case.
Well, I mean, it is simply true that right around the time he ends up back there, he publishes a book that gets tons of attention in the mainstream press, in big magazines and newspapers, gets him on television, about this little town and how he's gone back there. He's sort of the hero. Again, sort of wrote his own prodigal son narrative from the prodigal son's perspective about how great he was.
Right.
I mean, it's not the father's perspective of, yes, I'm happy to have him back. It's the prodigal son's like, aren't I great that I'm back? So I could totally see that they would not receive that well. But then again, that assumes they even read the damn book. I mean, maybe they didn't.
Maybe they didn't, but they got all this. I mean, they got the stories, right? As you said, it got an enormous amount of attention. There were probably literally reporters there who were interviewing these people, asking them about themselves, but through the lens of this book that Rod wrote that was very complimentary of them. But as you know, as a journalist, to be represented by another person is never an easy thing, even if they're complimentary of you, because you might be perceived of as it's caricature. This person didn't really know me. They don't understand the situation.
And it's also interesting, a different dimension to this is, if we were going to, and I'll say this just hypothetically for the sake of the discussion, if we assume something like a Freudian narrative that he left and then even he broke from the father and the family, but how did he do it? By becoming a very well-known and well-established right-wing writer, which was the default politics of his upbringing. You didn't mention the fact that Rod discovered and then, of course, publicly admitted that his father was a member of the KKK. Right. So that's the kind of politics of the town and the family. And Rod sort of, what he does is a typically kind of Hegelian reenactment of the story at the level of ideas, of Geist, of spiritual striving and thought, and then goes back to the town from that perspective as a kind of, as I described it in describing his Catholicism as a convert, as a kind of beautifully interwoven, lace-threaded constellation of ideas. Yeah, right. That's his conservatism. And yet, the conservatism of that family and that town is not that. It's not one that makes kind of coherent policy sense, and if you hold this view, it entails 17 other positions one must hold, and if you don't, you're confused, and let me explain it to you. That's like folk conservative versus ideological conservative. Right. And so even if when it comes to like the voting record of these people, and even if they are exactly in parallel, when it comes to human interaction, it could be like speaking an utterly foreign language, totally not getting each other. And Rod seeming like, oh, he thinks he's so smart, so hoity-toity, thinks he knows it better than we do. And not because of any fault of Rod, other than maybe lack of some self-awareness about this dynamic. And again, I'm not presupposing this is true. This is all speculative. I simply think that one thread in some of these tensions that he encountered when he went home could have been that they were simply speaking different cultural languages.
You had said earlier, and maybe you can tell me if this is more what you meant by it than how I interpreted it when you talk about kind of Rod and purity, which is he's always trying to establish a kind of unity of things in whatever the sort of system is or the space in which he's invested in that. And so there's various things that produces. One of them is, I think, blindness to the sort of nuances and the complexities or the imperfections of the thing that he's trying to, impose this sort of perfect structure on, right? So that's not just different languages. That is him not seeing in a very sort of intimate way the people who he's looking at, right? He's looking at them through the lens of this perfect crystalline structure that he has established, right? And that is not a pleasant way to be treated by somebody else, right? So it's not just different language, it's a way of kind of relating to another person that I think is unpleasant. I mean, the other thing, and this goes to some of the other stuff, is, and some of what's kind of sometimes appealing about him is he puts so much pressure on the structure that ultimately is not able to do what a lot of either more opportunistic or more flexible people are able to do when you run into these kind of dissonances, right? So faced with the priest abuse scandal, he is not able to do what Father John Newhouse did or what maybe the writers at the National Review did, which is figure out how to trim their sails in such a way that they were able to hold on to the church. And Rod cannot, right? He cannot contain this. And, similarly, he's gotten into trouble lately for calling out anti-Semitism on the right, because anti-Semitism, being against anti-Semitism, is just enough of a foundational constituent of his worldview that he ultimately can't look the other way when Tucker Carlson has Nick Fuentes on or whatever it is, or Candace Owens, or all of these things. And then he's forced to it, which is part of what's a kind of appealing about him, right? There's not a kind of cravenness or an opportunism to him.
And it shows that his ideology, though it overlaps with the Republican Party, conservative movements, Trump movement, whatever you want to call it. It overlaps with that on a lot of stuff. But in the end, and this is one of the things that to this day I find very admirable about him. It's really an ideology one.
Right.
It's almost happenstance that it overlaps so well with these configurations in our politics, because in the end, and you can say this on positive and negative ways. So I will say on the Jewish stuff, on anti-Semitism, on Fuentes, and his good friend, Tucker Carlson, his good friend, J.D. Vance. My God, the connections the man has built up over the years. Didn't he
kind of make J.D. Vance in a sense? I mean, didn't he play a really
he played a definite role in elevating his profile when Vance's memoir first dropped. He helped put it on the map. So but yet Vance has now is I think not communicating with him like he used to. And that might not mean in the end they might end up being good old pals down the way, but I think Vance knows who he is and where he is and what's dangerous and not, and Rod has now made himself untouchable at the moment while still in the Trump administration. But yet you did not get a sense that Rod was sitting around going, you know what, I gotta call out Vance on this, but I really can't, because then I'll lose my connection to this guy in the White House. Because he's too pure. That's that purity again. He's too concerned with the capital T truth, and capital T truth for him includes don't be a fucking anti-Semite. Right. And however, on race, he has total blinders on that, and that is not a factor for him whatsoever.
Notwithstanding that weird book that he co-wrote with the guy from The Wire about New Orleans, I think, after Katrina. Have you read that book?
I don't even remember.
Okay, it's not on his
Really?
Wikipedia book.
It's been memory hold.
Somehow he was contracted. What's the guy's name? Is it Wendell? Anyway, Bunk on The Wire. You know, McNulty's partner.
I don't remember any of this.
Okay, but do you know that actor? And then he was the star
Yeah.
of Treme, right? And so he's from New Orleans. He's kind of passionately dedicated. Somehow he ended up contracting with Rod Dreher to write a book about, I don't know if it was during the flood, or I think it was about the rebuilding of New Orleans after Katrina. That's this very, like, basically you would imagine that the co-writer is just some good liberal like you and me or something like this. Just some good racially liberal, uplifting book about. So this is weird phenomenon in his corpus and is not in his Wikipedia bio, which is strange. But yes, on race, he's a disaster, right? And it's I'm sure in his ideology is like, absolutely don't be a racist, but it doesn't have the same force, or at least maybe the same awareness behind it, where it doesn't include like a constant reiteration of tropes and recycling of stories that are so clearly racist chum for the racist masses or something like that.
His sensibility on these things, well, I mean, ultimately maybe come just from the fact that he was raised in a family with a father who was in the KKK. I don't know what that was like, but clearly since I've known him, like all the way back to, he's the kind of guy who I knew when Jesse Jackson died a couple months ago, I knew Rod was going to do a big fat post on him.
We're going to learn about Tawana Brawley. We're going to learn about
Tawana Brawley, and the racial shakedowns, and the Al Sharpton, and all of that New York Post Giuliani administration era stuff. Now, I worked for Giuliani for a brief period as a speechwriter, so I wasn't above writing speeches for the guy for various reasons back then. But for Rod, that view that the civil rights movement became a sort of shakedown operation of white people that turned into a kind of reverse racism, which is now by far the bigger problem. George Floyd was just a total drug addict who was going to drop dead of a heart attack that evening anyway. And this poor cop who's now had his life ruined and he's in jail when the guy was going to die anyway. And so what is his knee was on his neck for 20 minutes. And like he went down that whole rabbit hole about that with the George Floyd killing, and led, for instance, I don't know if you know the writer Alan Jacobs.
Yeah, is he at Baylor? Is he the kind of Christian?
Yeah,
I think I've emailed him.
He's at Baylor and he writes about literature.
He's a pretty
a lot.
reasonable dude, isn't he?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I love him.
Yeah.
He's a fabulous guy, one of the most decent evangelical writers around, very moderate and sensible. He's been friends with Rod as long as I have, and he basically like burned him on social media and on his blog after that, and was like, I can't deal with you anymore.
Did you ever have a split with Rod? Was there ever a public?
I did have a split around that same time when Rod wrote some posts about immigration to Europe that struck me as he basically wrote a post in which he endorsed a speech that Orban gave about how Christianity is doomed in Europe because of immigration, and then Rod's spin on it made it seem as if this would be caused by immigration to Europe from Africa, even though many of those African immigrants are Christians.
Right.
And I called him out for this in a Substack post saying, don't you see that you're completely conflating things in a way that shows that your issue is like not, is it Islam or is it black people? Like this is just not clear.
Did he respond?
He did. We went back and forth several times. It got kind of nasty and I sort of cut him off at that point and I stopped writing about him. But then I would occasionally still mention him. But then over the anti-Semitism stuff about 6 months ago, I reached out to him, wrote a couple of nice pieces about him having to do with the Fuentes stuff. And since then, we've each given each other gratis subscriptions to our things. And
so when you had that kind of split over the immigration stuff, were you still friends in any meaningful sense? Like, I mean, were you people who got lunch once in a while?
No,
or
I mean, he's lived in, he's been living in Hungary, and before that he was in Louisiana. I haven't seen him with my own eyes since I went to a book talk he gave around the Dante book, probably 2016-ish. So that was the last time I've seen him in person. But we would exchange emails. Like when he announced his pending divorce, I immediately sent him an email saying, "Oh God, I'm so sorry about this." And so we would touch base occasionally, and I would occasionally send him a note saying, "I really think you're off base on this. This is wrong." And I've written about him. Like, I wrote a number of columns at the Week about the Benedict Option book and how I thought. I continue to think that book interpreted as I interpreted, not the way he portrays it. I think that's an extremely important book. And like in the future, intellectual historians of that period of American politics are going to treat that book as really an important moment in the evolution of the religious right.
You think it's important in terms of its influence. I'm trying to remember, I did read it. I mean, the basic argument, the Benedict option is essentially, I don't remember the kind of, ecclesiastical history specifically, but as kind of during the Dark Ages, there were people for whom the monasteries became the kind of repository of kind of ancient wisdom and learning and preserved it during these centuries of darkness and barbarism, so that, when the Renaissance came along, not that they had that specific intention, but that it was preserved so that the real civilization could reassert itself later on and have some of these resources. And his argument was essentially, now is the time for us, good believing Christians, believers in sort of civilization, however you define that, need to retreat to our small communities, preserve the flame, so that when these, looming dark ages come to an end, there are kind of repositories of learning and faith and human goodness and flourishing human organization that can be the seeds from which new civilization grows. Something like that, right?
Yeah, that's the general thrust of it. And for me, I don't think it's important so much in its influence as in the way that a historian would be interested in it. For me, is more interesting than influence. For me, is how a work of like a book, a work of art or a work of culture ends up being an unintended expression of its moment. And what that book was an expression of the second Obama administration's despair on the religious right. In other words, we have lost the culture. We are a moral minority, not a majority. We must figure out how to preserve ourselves in a country that is no longer ours. Now, that doesn't mean, as he always defensively says, I'm not saying his argument was, don't vote, don't participate in politics, just go behind the wall and read old theology books and raise your kids at home and make them good little Christians. That's in there. But no, sure, yeah, read the Benedict option. You'll still vote. You'll still be a religious right guy. You'll still vote for Republicans, still hate abortion, still oppose gay marriage. Yes, yes, yes. But the general approach, if you read it in the light of the moral majority, Falwell, Robertson, Newhouse, evangelicals and Catholics together, the George W. Bush administration, all of that, it is a bookend to that era saying we were wrong, we failed, we have lost the culture, the hope of all those people that we either are the true majority and are only being kept from power by these elites who can easily be toppled and then we'll take over, or we're, just short of a majority and all we have to do is all show up on election day and show that we really can win.
Right.
That hope was not either we failed at it or it was never possible. It was always a delusion. We can be open on that question. But the story is that it failed and we have to regroup and figure something else out. In other words, there is no place at all in that book for a Donald Trump.
So what I was going to say,
or a Viktor Orban.
The terrible irony of this, and Rod is himself an example of this, is that realization and that recognition could actually be the start of what would be a kind of mature process of mourning a kind of understanding of the world or one's place in the world in a way. I've just been rereading some Jonathan Lear.
Oh yeah, his great book about the what's the name of the
Well, his last book was Imagining the End. Oh, and then there was
that, but I'm thinking of Radical Hope.
Radical Hope. Well, actually, right, and I was looking at both of those books. So what it would look like to one imagines like this recognition, we are not, whether we ever were, we are a moral minority, right? And then that is a profound threat and a profound loss. And then the question is, what does one do with that? And the mature psyche starts to mourn it, finds ways to engage with it creatively, to reflect on what it meant, and then use that to evolve into sort of develop what is the sort of flourishing, psychologically flourishing, mature way to orient to the world now that I have grieved or mourned this thing that I had or thought that I had that I've lost.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I thought that book when it came out.
Well, it would have been great, right?
It would have been great. And I thought it could be sort of, to speak of Newhouse's seminal book for the earlier religious right, The Naked Public Square, that like this book was sort of a bookend to that era, and it was a pivot to exactly what you're saying for the future of people disposed like R.O.D. But what happened is, one of the great ironies is that the book was published in January of 2017 as Donald Trump is taking the oath of office, and Viktor Orban who has already been in power since 2010, but is now really portraying himself as like the definitive defender of anti-liberalism in Europe, opposing the EU in the name of everything R.O.D believes in. And so he immediately, when he's supposed to be promoting this book, which it isn't, again, I don't want to say it advocates quietism, but it is a mournful book about those earlier hopes for the religious right. And he rightly did not support Trump in 2016 because he realized that he was a scumbag, not a Christian, not the right kind of person. But the evangelicals were far more transactional. And in the end, by election day in 2016, most of them had concluded it was in our interest to hire basically a mobster to be our tough guy, strongman defender. And if we give him support, he'll be there for us. And that new, much more cynical model of how you engage in politics on the religious right has been the story ever since.
Well, and I mean, in a sense, maybe worse than that, because what may have started as cynicism and in a lot of cases has actually morphed into, what do we call it? Some kind of weird, Sullivan would probably call it like a Christianist identity, right? So it's actually come back and influenced a lot of these people's experiences of what it means to be a Christian in a sort of cultural nationalist way. So it's even worse than that, right? Like we could not be a moral majority. So what we will try now to be is this kind of white identitarian majority, because the moral majority is no longer an option on the table, which is like, couldn't you go do the Benedict option? Could you please go do the Benedict option, right? And and R.O.D is a mixed bag on this, right? Because it's like when what he should have been doing was, okay, maybe he doesn't have to move back to the small town in Louisiana where everybody hates him, but he should have gone back to his church and his community and live, not be quietist, but live the small life. He fucking moves to Hungary, right? Like how Benedict is that? Let's not. I mean, whatever. You could construct some story, but I mean, he moves to Hungary to live on the government's dime. I mean,
he and all the other post-liberals who did that, Gladden Pappin and Patrick Deneen's frequent visits, all the junkets run through the Danube Institute. I mean, all those people, it was like leftists moving to Havana or Hanoi. It really was that. Not that Orban's Hungary was totalitarian in that sense, but it is psychologically, it was very, very parallel. That like, you don't do that if you think, in 3 years he could be out of office and there could be a liberal in charge, right? Like you maybe visit, you do like a semester there on a grant. You don't like pick up and like Gladden Pappin like moved his family to Budapest so that he could be the head of a Hungarian think tank. It was like the Brookings Institution. If the Brookings Institution had were directly run by the Democratic Party headed by Obama.
He's just part of the propaganda machine of the Hungarian government.
Yeah, and you only do that if you assume this is permanent. This is just the way Hungary is going to be now forever.
Right.
That's not, it's one thing to visit a foreign country while a party you're aligned with is in power. It's another thing to relocate there and completely reorient your place on the globe by that regime. You only do that if you think this isn't just a party that's won temporarily. It's totally remade what it is as a country. And that was always kind of crazy.
I mean, the contradictions for R.O.D at this point in various ways are so intense. So he moves to Hungary. He moves away from some of his kids. He had this, presumably excruciating divorce, I think pretty unhappy marriage for a long time. And he moves away from his kids, except maybe one of them was in Hungary or somewhere in Europe or something like that.
Yeah, one came with him. I actually will say ahead of time that I won't go near that. In talking to you, I have communicated privately with him about this stuff, and the divorce was an ugly, ugly thing, and there's all kinds of stuff that is not known publicly, and part of that is that there was a huge fissure in the family where the other two kids were turned against him in a way that made it was not that he fled them. It was that even staying anywhere in proximity to them, given the way things worked out, would have been very, very painful.
I'm happy to. I'm glad you corrected me somewhat, because let me reframe that. I mean, in a more sympathetic way, which is, the point was not to sort of accuse him of being an absentee father. The point was to suggest that the contradiction he lives with, the emotional pressure, must be super intense, because I don't claim to judge how people behave or how they handle the aftermath of that kind of very private and personal and excruciatingly painful experience. But I believe him that he's deeply loves his kids. And so just the fact of being that far away from them, much less, if there's a kind of split in the family and people are not speaking to each other or something like that, to be thousands of miles away from your kids for whatever reason, while you're also advocating for a kind of philosophical and religious worldview where the emphasis on families and traditional values and all of these things is so intense. And I think you just see it. Part of his kind of logoria, part of his compulsive writing and his compulsivity in all of these things is the pretty natural product of somebody who is not doing such a great job kind of internally reckoning with, reconciling all of their tensions. We all contain tensions, contradictions, and part of the nature of being human is just the struggle to process those, and you can resolve some of them and you can't resolve others. I don't think R.O.D is doing such a great job of that. And I think part of what you're describing in the nature of his product and his writing is just the evident result of that.
Yeah, that might be the case. I don't feel entirely comfortable speculating.
Nobody's as comfortable psychologizing people as I am, but I've spent a lot of time reading Rod Dreher.
I do. Believe me, I read Matt Iglesias every single day, and I have a friend who will spend a half hour just why is he doing this? Why is he doing that? What's he saying here? This is because this thing is going on. But I know I've met Matt, we know each other vaguely, but he's not a friend.
Right, you're not going to do it publicly.
Whereas R.O.D is a friend, and we've had a tough friendship with some ups and downs and breaks, and I do want to try to be as generous as I can with him, and I know that you're right, that he suffers. It's very, very painful. He's sort of going through life with this burden of his broken family on his shoulders. And again, it's his marital family and kids, and then also his larger family in Louisiana. And it hurts a lot. It's painful, and he struggles with it. And I agree with you, psychologically speaking, that some of the behavior and kind of tics of his writing persona are no doubt downstream of a lot of this stuff.
What do you think? One of the things I've thought about R.O.D, that makes him such a sort of compelling figure, both to the people who admire him as fans, as readers, but also to people like you and me. And I think there's like a 10-hour supercut of like Chapo Trap House, like talking about
Oh, really? I didn't even know that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure in not very charitable ways, right? But like, he's a compelling figure. And I think part of it is he does have this connection to like the deep currents of things, right? The deep currents of cultural shifts. And you were saying this with his Benedict book, but it's not just that. There is something about the way he is, and I think his exposure to the world, and like, just the thinner defenses that he throws up against the kind of the data of the world than most of us, and whatever, just his brain, his temperament, all of those things that connects him to the deep well springs of something.
Yes, I completely agree. And it is exactly as you said earlier, how I'm able now, once again, to read him on an almost daily basis and disagree with a good, I don't know, 2/3 to 3/4 of it, sometimes 100% on a certain day, and yet still feel like I'm getting something out of it, because it matters to me to know what he's seeing, because he sees things that others don't.
Right.
And that's this openness you're talking about. And again, it is uncanny how much overlap there is between his personal quest for capital T truth and the various evolutions and tumults and turbulence of the American right as it's evolved. But in a weird way, that early book of his, which he was writing when I first knew him, the CrunchyCon book, is a weird prefigurement of like post-liberal, Deneen-ish Trump-era right. Like this sort of, Sohrab Mamari version of like, take some stuff from the left and blend it with some stuff from the right, jettison the libertarianism and embrace the kind of weird countercultural aspects of it. Like, he was on to that early and seeing that there was a configuring of the American right that could combine elements of the left with other elements of the right that is prescient. And again, I'm not saying that to give him like any kind of credit for being a guru. It has to do, it's evidence of what you're talking about, of a kind of openness. And I really do think, I began by saying again, the uncanniness of the overlap with the right, but I do believe deep down that no stance that he ever takes is motivated by a thought that this is what I have to say to advance the agenda.
Right.
If it does advance the agenda, then he'll say, cool, he'll put his thumbs up and he'll figure, all right, I'm contributing to something I care about. But he never does it for that reason. And that is damn rare among writers. I mean, even writers I read all the time and respect, someone like, a Jonathan Chait, an Ezra Klein, a Matt Iglesias, people I read all the time and I agree with more like 70 to 80% as opposed to R.O.D down at around 20%. But they're saying what they're saying very often as a kind of calculus of what would be good to say to get this tranche of voters so we can win, so we can use power to do these things I want to do with that power. And that's nothing wrong with that. That's being a public intellectual, and one of its definitions is talking in sort of consequentialist utilitarian terms about how to use ideas to advance what I care about in the world. But I actually don't do it that way. And R.O.D also doesn't do it that way. We are trying to figure out what the fuck is going on. And if that overlaps with a political agenda that we can help with, okay, but that's not the point. And that's why I still listen to him and still read him. And even when he drives me crazy, I know that what I'm disagreeing with is him and not something he's done to sell his soul, to hawk his wares in the marketplace. And that is rare, and I respect him for it greatly.
I can't bear it. I can't quite. I've tried. I mean, I don't disagree with anything you just said, but I've tried to read him regularly, and it just sort of wears at me. I was going to say, I was thinking, we were saying Rod sees things, including, I was going to add, ghosts and demons and angels. I don't know if you read.
Yeah, we didn't get to that part yet. No, I have not read the most recent.
Okay, I mean, I
book.
read that book, and that's what I interviewed him about, and I mean. There's something there too, right? There's something there too in the sense of like, I think reading that book of his kind of helped me assimilate something I'd known but not quite known, which is just how prevalent belief in those things is in our culture, and maybe always has been. I'm not sure. I don't know if that's a new thing. I mean, I think people have joked about Tucker Carlson talking about some encounter he had with demons or something like that. But like, even that, like, putting aside what one thinks of the truth or falsity of it, and I'm just a kind of straight up materialist on these things, like, it was valuable for me. And that's not particularly despairing or sort of, that's a gentler book. Like, that's not a hard book to sort of absorb in that sense. Like, the kind of angry, bitter Rod doesn't come out to play as much in that book. But it was valuable to read that stuff and to just read it from the perspective of what you were saying. This is something he genuinely believes, right? This is not a cynical thing. When he is talking about some encounter he's had when he was touched by an angel, or when he's going to visit this, remember there was a couple where the wife was possessed, and he's talking about how, and he witnesses it firsthand, right? He's talking to her in the presence of her husband. It's something like he's talking to her in the presence of her husband who's wearing a cross or has a flask of holy water or something like that. And the husband says, okay, observe what happens to her when I walk out of the room. And so the husband walks out of the room. And then this is some upper middle class couple on the Upper West Side of Manhattan or something like that. And the minute the husband walks out of the room and the cross or the flask of holy water is kind of far enough away, the wife starts speaking in tongues and her whole body language changes and she doesn't sound the same. And these are things that Rod firsthand witnesses that he's reporting back to us, right? And so the sincerity of that, the earnestness of it, for all the reasons you just said, is unquestioned. And that is something that I have to deal with and not dismiss, honestly, not dismiss even from a sort of epistemological sense, because he ain't the only one who feels that way about the world. In fact, humankind, for most of its history, has had a pretty uncomplicated belief in the supernatural. Mm-hmm. But then also just from that kind of sense of wanting to be tapped into what the kind of political currents and subcurrents are, that is a very useful thing to read.
Sure. I mean, and I've read him enough on it that I know exactly what's in that book, and I have enough of an education in the history of political philosophy to know I could almost anticipate the entire book in my own head. So I don't feel the need to actually read it.
That's right. I think if you've been reading Rod's
I know
blog
where he's
day after day, you don't really need to read most of his books.
Yeah, but my attitude about that stuff is, that's what it is to be a human being for almost all of human history, is that there's a permeable membrane between nature and supernature, and actually for most people there's no distinction between those two things. They just live in an enchanted world. Now, I am not a kind of hardcore materialist, pro-enlightenment, banish all that stuff, disenchant the world kind of guy, because in the end I don't think that's possible. However, I do think a world in which that stuff is in general marginalized, viewed as questionable, people respond to it with skepticism. Education is understood as instilling a skepticism about it, even if it can't eliminate it entirely, is all things considered better than a world without that skepticism. And I don't like, I guess I would say, that Rod has chosen to write stuff that putting his thumb on the other side of that scale, like implying that what we need is intellectuals making the case for welcoming a free, bringing all that back in, that somehow life is fuller if we live in an enchanted world and live in wonder in that sense. I'm all in favor of Aristotle saying philosophy begins in wonder, but that doesn't mean it begins in thinking that I was mauled by a demon in bed last night like Tucker Carlson claims he thinks. And that I'm pretty sure Rod completely believes this. In fact, for all I know, he hasn't told me this, but for all I know, he thinks that the battle was lost, and that's why Tucker's become an anti-Semite, because the demon won.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, that would be a perfectly legitimate explanation for Rod.
No, I don't know that there's anything Rod Dreher's ever written that I agree with or find particularly illuminating. What I find illuminating is him as a text, right? Or I find it illuminating reading it, interpreting it as kind of evidence, in exactly the way you were talking about with the kind of Benedict option as an example of this kind of phenomenon of the kind of profound demoralization of the moral majority or the moral not majority. I read it as evidence of something that is going on beneath the surface or not so beneath the surface that Rod is tapped into because of his disposition, because of who he is. I don't think he's ever written anything that I find particularly appealing. I don't find him a particularly illuminating writer. I think he's too psychologically lacking in perception. I mean, what does Rod get? What does he write about well?
I mean, it's been so long. I've probably read 1 million words by the guy. And it's been a long time. I mean, I have found him insightful on certain topics. I find him worthwhile substantively in the way that a certain memoir can be substantively useful as a kind of way of writing about oneself and one's experience that touches me. Not in the sense of I learned something about the world from him.
Okay.
But then again, I'm on certain culture war issues, I've appreciated some of what he has to say. I think he tends to be a little meaner than he should be and less generous than he should be at times.
Yeah.
But I have deeply conflicted to negative feelings about a lot of the trans ideology stuff. So he and I overlap on that.
Well, and I mean, I overlap with him on some of the anti-woke stuff. I guess what I would say, it's not that there might be some stretch of 800 words in some 8,000 word post where I think he's writing, fluently and kind of compellingly about some topic. It's just that the other 7,200 words will be just endless kind of nut picking of, woke activists doing this or that or whatever. I still think the way you were talking about reading him, the way you were characterizing why you still read him was mostly in the vein that I'm talking about, which is he's symptomatic. He's sort of usefully symptomatic.
Yeah, and an interesting human being. And again, it has to do with, in a way, the way I look at things anthropologically, a smart, open guy, and I mean open-minded in the sense we were talking about, not in the sense it's usually used, open to the world. He's a mind, and the world, in its most well-rounded sense of that word, meaning a world of meaning that we inhabit. A mind like his sees aspects of that world in a way that can be very interesting and illuminating in a way that's different than I'll read a book by, say, a really smart science popularizer to learn about bosons or something.
Right.
It's not that he's teaching me something that's true about the world in the sense of something in the world. He's giving me a perspective on how the world looks to someone who is like him, who is deeply discontented with the way, who feels out of step with the way the world is going, which is why, even though he is now, he bought into Orban, he bought into Trump eventually, and even now he's again discontented with Trump because Trump too sucks in all kinds of ways that I can sometimes even agree with him about. He still isn't happy. He's almost never finally things are going my way. Yeah. He's always sure we're just a couple of weeks away from an imminent apocalypse. And as I put it in a recent post that you liked and that contributed to us talking about what our agenda would be here, he sort of partly dreads this like someone would dread an axe murderer looming down over him with the weapon, and deeply longs for this to actually be something he gets to live through, because then he'll know, yes, I knew it. I was right.
Yeah.
And that blend of, oh my God, I can't believe this terrible thing is going to happen, and oh my God, I hope this terrible thing happens. That's R.O.D, and I find it illuminating to get to look at the world through those eyes.
Yeah.
Because like with the enchantment thing, there are a lot of people who see it that way.
I was thinking about whether there were left-wing writers who served the same function for me that R.O.D does to some extent on the right. And the only thing that came to mind, and they're very different kinds of figures, but there is that sort of like Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, Walter Kern type who are sort of, and I mean, I don't even know what it would mean to call them left-wing anymore, but at least Taibbi and Greenwald were at one sense, where they're sort of usefully out of step in a slightly crazy way with the mainstream, and there are signals that one can pick up on by reading them that are useful. And if you totally exclude those people from your sort of reading diet, there are just fundamental things you're going to miss out on. You have to run it through your filter. But neither of them is the sort of R.O.D type in a way. I was just thinking about whether I had people like that on the left who I find useful in that way.
No, I think that's actually a pretty good parallel to the left. I have at times liked Walter Kern, but he's gone completely off the deep end. By this point, he blocked me a few years ago, even though I edited a piece for him in Newsweek. And he knows that. Like, we have an actual physical world relationship professionally, and yet he blocked me because I merely raised a question slightly critically about a blog post of his during the pandemic, and just instantly cut off. There's some people like that who, like, if you even suggest a criticism, they're just like, you're dead to me. Right. I only want an echo chamber. But I would say that, like, the things in those people, like Taibbi and Greenwald and Kern now, the things that are like what you're saying make them indistinguishable from the right, and I just read the right-wing analogs to them by this point. Like, I don't think there's anything discernibly left about them. The left people who I really learn something from are actually different types. Like, they're not the crazy types. They're just people I largely disagree with, but I learn productively from them. People like Corey Robin, John Gantz, although he's actually not as far left as I think he likes to think he is. And then who else? Like, well, the two guys who do the Know Your Enemy podcast.
Oh, yeah. Adler Bell and whatever. Sitman and Adler Bell.
Yeah, Sitman and Adler Bell. Like, though, both of them I love, and I learn from them all the time on the podcast, and when they write, I love reading them as well.
I say this, and yet I don't actually read Greenwald. Greenwald does have the virtue, I think, of being like R.O.D in the sense that one doesn't fear that he's doing it for opportunistic reasons. Like,
that's
Greenwald seems utterly happy to torch any relationship he has if his inner voice is telling him to do something.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a value in that, right? But I don't actually read him, so I'm not. You may be right.
I haven't read him in probably close to 4 years now.
Well, he also paywalls almost everything, and so that's a factor too. I'm not going to pay money to like mostly be annoyed and then occasionally have like a morsel of like some alternative perspective.
Yeah, I just find those people, there's one way in which I see them as different than R.O.D, is that it might not align with like a party ideology or a movement ideology. So in that it's similar to R.O.D, but epistemologically, they are engaging, and I've written about Greenwald along these lines. I did a post very early on. One of the first posts I wrote for my Substack 4 years ago was about Glenn Greenwald as a case study in selective skepticism, who is absolutely radically skeptical about anyone center or like anyone centrist at all, like establishment liberal. He ostensibly isn't as skeptical of people on the left, but he never engages with them and really isn't in that world at all anymore. And he is not skeptical at all of the Trumpist right, including all those years he went on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox while Carlson was interspersing his interviews with Greenwald with other stuff like attacking immigration, attacking black people, defending, shooting rioters and protesters, and just absolutely heinous stuff that Greenwald sort of was like, yeah, so what? Who cares? At least he's not a centrist liberal. At least he's not implicated in Bush going to war in Iraq. Like, that for him became the equivalent of like R.O.D's commitment to social conservative Catholic doctrine, and which became his sort of core commitment that sort of defines everything else.
Yeah.
For Greenwald, it became anyone who is implicated in that stuff that really pissed me off in the aughts. Right. And that's just crazy. Like, to change your mind, to rearrange your mental furniture so that all it does is cut off, who treats like Kamala Harris as profoundly worse than Donald Trump in some way. Like, that's just insane. Like,
I realized, and I'll let you go, I realized who the closest thing to a left-wing R.O.D. Dreher is, and it's Freddie DeBoer. I think Freddie's much better than R.O.D., but he does have an ideology of one. He follows, he marches to the beat of his own drum. He's more capable of kind of reining it in certain ways than R.O.D. is.
I loved your long interview with him a few months ago.
Yeah, but I just started reading I have an advanced copy of his new book on mental health. It's actually very good. It's actually the best thing so far. I mean, I'm not that far into it. It's actually the best. He hasn't quite figured out how to bring it to this point, to a book-length thing, and I think this might be the one where he nails it. But Freddie's the closest thing. I think Freddie's the left-wing R.O.D. Dreher.
No, you might be right, although whereas R.O.D. is very clearly on the right, DeBoer is another one of these guys, like the other ones we were talking about, where it's not that I think he's right-wing, but what's left-wing about him? He's just a kind of a grumpy guy who hates a certain kind of center-left wokey sensibility. And as you were saying, like, I agree with when he gets on a good tear.
Yeah.
He's great at that, and I agree with it. I can endorse a lot of it. But on what is he actually left-wing? I guess there are a few things about education policy and like vague sneering at quote unquote capitalism, but like I don't know where he really truly is politically.
That's a good question. Well, I have to do another episode with Freddie or maybe on Freddie. Damon, I'll let you go. This was fantastic. We went to some interesting places.
Yeah, it was great.
So,
I'm delighted. I'll come on anytime, and I hope you'll have me back when my Strauss book finally appears.
Of course,
in,
yeah.
A little under 2 years. It'll be a while.
I'll have to finally read some Strauss, or actually I won't. I'll just read your book.
Just read my book on Strauss. It'll be the best Strauss you'll ever read.
All right, have a good one.
All right, take care. Bye.
See you. This has been another episode of Eminent Americans. Big thanks to Josh Howard for editing this episode of the podcast. Thanks to Alec Owensworth, legendary frontman of Clap Your Hands Say Yeah, for letting us use his music for our intro and outro. If you've enjoyed the show, which I imagine you have if you made it this far, please rate us and comment on your podcast platform of choice. And if you want to connect with me personally for whatever reason, you can get me at djops@gmail.com, djopps@gmail.com. I promise to respond in a relatively timely fashion as long as you are relatively civil in your communique. As the great Bill and Ted once said, be excellent to each other. Peace.